I want to talk first about the Declaration of the State of Israel and the Law of Return. So these two short primary sources that you had to think about the creation of the State of Israel. So this Declaration of the State of Israel is the law for the State of Israel. It's the only law. There's not one there's a document that works like a constitution, and this is sort of more similar to the Declaration of Independence in the United States. But this is it. Okay, so this is for all Israelis, whether it's Arab Israelis, Jewish Israelis, or other people. So you can see from looking through this that there's a way of thinking about the space of the land of Israel that is related to an idea that Jews have longed to return to their true homeland since the destruction of the first temple. There's a claim that Jews have already improved the land or had already improved the land. This sort of language about making the desert bloom, doing things like that. And implied in some places other than these texts stated explicitly, there are claims that this is to suggest that the people who live on the land, which is to say people who if they received citizenship were called Arab Israelis, who today we would call Palestinians, although many Jews, not all by any means, but many would want to say that really Palestinian nationalism is a lie or a myth, and that part of that might be related to the implicit claim here, which would be that Palestinians or Arabs in general didn't take good enough care of the land. That's a sort of strange claim to make about a desert, to say that they've let it be a desert. But this is really how Zionism worked and thought, and Jews really saw this as such a joyous moment for being able to have a homeland where they were full citizens. So we see this kind of preamble to thinking about what the state even is, that it's a place of returning to something ancestral. It's even to think of it as a return is a work of imagination, which is to say we all imagine our relationship to something like a nation, that we're not ever going to know all of the people who live in it, even in our lifetime. And so we have to do some kind of cognitive work to understand our relationship to the other people who are part of our state or part of our nation group. Then with the law of return, this is where we really see the policy that pulls together this idea that all Jews have a right to live in the land of Israel, and that what it means to really call the state of Israel a Jewish state. So it is possible for non-Jews to be citizens. There are Arab Israelis, and they also have even some of their own political parties. There are other major groups living in the land of Israel today who are neither Palestinian nor Jewish. There are a lot of what are often called guest workers, particularly from Southeast Asia, who are living there, and there are kind of new questions about their citizenship or their relationship to the state and the other populations who are living in this area. But what we see with the land of Israel is really a foundational policy. But we see a big shift from 1950 to 1970. So in 1950, this is really one of the first laws that the Israeli parliament, which is called the Knesset, passed. And it starts off by saying every Jew has the right to come to this country as an ole, or an immigrant. And so ole is related to this word aliyah, which means to go up, right? We've talked about the burnt offering as coming from the same root, to go up, and it means it's used because for Jewish immigrants to the land of Israel, it's not the general word for immigrant, but it's used for Jews moving to the land of Israel or just going there for a little while, because the idea is that they go up in holy status. So even though it's a secular state, there is this kind of traditional, what we might see as religious language about Jewishness that's related there. And that's hard to translate, right? That it wouldn't come through if you only said immigrant. So initially, really the way that this law works is that who's Jewish, right, is basically a central question for this document. It's to say that anyone who had at least one Jewish grandparent had a right to immigrate to the land of Israel and become a citizen. And indeed, for a very long time, even through points in my lifetime, that a person could land in the airport and kind of within something that could be measured in minutes or hours, have some paperwork saying that they have a right to be there and that they're working on their citizenship. So for Jews, it's always been really easy to get citizenship as a result of this law. That the state presented itself as a place of refuge, and so that also has to do with the definition then of who's Jewish. It's profoundly influenced by Nazi policy, that anyone could be murdered by the Nazis as a Jew if they had one Jewish grandparent. Okay, so that would be being a quarter Jewish in the way that we sometimes talk. So in 1970, you see that idea of a child or a grandchild of a Jew, but then there's also in 4b this statement that a Jew means a person who was born of a Jewish mother or has become converted to Judaism, right? So how do you know that the grandparent is Jewish is kind of the question then, right? So it's teleological. It doesn't really define who a Jew is. Here it says they have a Jewish mother. This is leaning on halakha, which is very much the basis for Jewish, what we might say religious definitions of Jewishness, but also certainly much larger cultural effects, that even for people who aren't necessarily so dedicated to halakha, that this would be maybe an important way of measuring Jewishness to them. So the state uses that, and in fact, the ruling on who's Jewish and whether they can become a citizen is partially affected by an Orthodox rabbinate, or basically a court of Jews who are experts in Jewish law, in halakha, who would make the decision if it was questionable as to whether or not someone would be admitted. So this point of conversion is kind of a sticking point, let's say, because if someone does a conversion in the United States through Reform Judaism or through conservative Judaism, for that matter, the state of Israel may require them to do another conversion according to Orthodox Judaism. So there is a real hierarchy of the place of these different movements of Judaism, that Orthodoxy has a certain kind of entrenchment with the state. And then we also see, this note that they have to have converted and not remained a member of another religion. That actually came out of a few things, but one of them was a court case. You can look it up, the Brother Daniel case. Someone who had been hidden as a child in a Catholic monastery and had grown up in Catholicism, but then discovered that his family was Jewish. He wanted to move the state of Israel, but he wanted to keep practicing the Catholicism that had saved him, that he'd grown up in, and the state ruled that actually he wasn't Jewish in the way that the state would accept, that he would have to stop practicing Christianity if he wanted to be able to move as a Jew. He didn't need to do a conversion to Judaism, but this kind of conflict of religion was an issue. And this would be kind of a way to do some test cases, I think, about spouses and things like that. Although in the case of spouses, as we see, there are explicit rights, and so it's a little more complicated. Okay, so it's certainly a very questionable or complicated question, let's say, is what I meant to say, idea of how to figure out who's Jewish. And I think it's clear that by 1970, even in just those 20 years, the state had existed long enough and came to serve really very different needs, both internally and worldwide, that's why we see this additional information that gets inserted to update the law of return.